She spent $50 million searching for the stranger who saved her life 18 years ago. Hired the best investigators. Searched every database. Followed every lead. What she never imagined was that he had been watching her every single night, cleaning her office, protecting her from shadows close enough to touch, yet invisible as air. The man she desperately sought was the janitor she ignored every day. Rebecca Callahan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, 36 floors above a city that sprawled beneath her like a conquered kingdom. At 36 years old, she commanded a technology empire worth billions, her sharp intellect and relentless drive having carved out a space in an industry that rarely welcomed women with such authority. Her reflection stared back from the glass platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon, ice blue eyes that could freeze a boardroom, designer suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Yet beneath the polished exterior lived a woman haunted by 18 years of searching for a ghost who had saved her life. The memory surfaced unbidden, as it did every morning at precisely 9:47. The screech of metal against metal. The acrid smell of burning rubber. The weight of twisted steel pinning her 18-year-old legs as darkness crept around the edges of her vision. Then salvation arrived in the form of gray eyes and a calm voice cutting through her panic. "Stay with me," he had said. "Don't close your eyes." "What's your name?" "Rebecca," she had whispered. Blood trickling from her forehead. "Beautiful name," he had replied. "I'm getting you out of here, Rebecca. Trust me." She remembered the warmth of his hands as he worked to free her from the wreckage of the train derailment outside Hartford. His tall, lean frame moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos surrounding them, the small scar near his left wrist that caught the emergency lights as he manipulated the twisted metal that had become her prison. Most of all, she remembered the moment their eyes met gray meeting blue, and feeling for the first time in her life that she was worth saving. The rescue had taken 43 minutes, according to official reports. But in Rebecca's memory, it existed outside of time, suspended in a moment where the only things that mattered were his voice calling her name and his hands working methodically to free her from what should have been her tomb. Then the paramedics arrived with their sirens and medical equipment, and in the chaos of stabilization procedures and family notifications, he vanished. No name exchanged beyond her own. No contact information. No way to thank him or even learn who he was. Just a ghost who had pulled her from the jaws of death and disappeared into the night, like something from a dream that felt too real to forget. The years that followed had been a testament to human resilience and the transformative power of obligation. Rebecca channeled her survivor's determination into academic excellence at Hartford College, where she graduated summa cum laude with degrees in business administration and computer science. She threw herself into entrepreneurship with the fervor of someone who understood that life was fragile and opportunity more fragile still. Her first company, built from her dorm room with 2 borrowed computers and an algorithm she developed for optimizing supply chain logistics, sold for $12 million before she turned 25. The second company, focused on artificial intelligence applications for financial markets, went public and made her worth $100 million by age 30. The third company, a comprehensive technology platform that revolutionized how corporations managed data security, established her as one of the most influential women in business, and pushed her net worth past the billion-dollar mark. But success felt hollow when measured against the emptiness in her chest, a void shaped exactly like those gray eyes, and that gentle voice that had convinced her she deserved to live. She had tried dating throughout her 20s and early 30s, of course. High-powered executives who understood the demands of building an empire. Brilliant entrepreneurs who spoke her language of innovation and market disruption. Politicians who saw her corporate connections as stepping stones to higher office. Academics who admired her intellect. Athletes who appreciated her competitive drive. Even a few artists who claimed they could see past her corporate armor to the person underneath. None of them understood the restlessness that drove her to work 18-hour days, 7 days a week. None of them comprehended why she would freeze in crowded restaurants, scanning faces for a familiar profile. None of them could explain why she kept a private investigator on permanent retainer despite having no leads to follow, no names to research, no concrete evidence that her mysterious savior even existed beyond the scars on her legs. And the memory burned into her consciousness. The relationships ended with predictable regularity. She was too driven, too distracted, too obviously searching for something that none of them could provide. They accused her of being emotionally unavailable, which was true. They suggested she needed therapy, which she tried. They recommended medication for what one psychiatrist diagnosed as complicated grief disorder combined with survivor's guilt and attachment trauma. But Rebecca knew the truth that no amount of professional intervention could address. She had left half her soul in that train wreck with a stranger who had shown her what it meant to be seen as worth saving, and no relationship could survive when one person was fundamentally incomplete. 3 years ago, Rebecca had made a decision that would consume $50 million and countless sleepless nights. She would find the man who saved her life, regardless of the cost in money, time, or corporate resources. Her board of directors questioned the wisdom of allocating such enormous sums to what they diplomatically termed personal security consulting, but Rebecca's controlling interest in the company made their objections merely advisory. Thomas Crawford, former FBI with credentials that cost her company 7 figures annually, assembled the most sophisticated private investigation team ever deployed for a single missing person case. His background in federal law enforcement had taught him that finding people required patience, resources, and systematic methodology. What it had not prepared him for was searching for someone who might not want to be found. Crawford's team expanded their search parameters to include military databases spanning the entire northeastern United States. They obtained access to emergency services records from Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, and Vermont, cross-referencing every rescue operation conducted within a 50-mile radius of the Hartford derailment site. They hired linguists to analyze the speech patterns Rebecca remembered, hoping to narrow geographical origins. They consulted with psychologists to construct personality profiles that might predict career choices and lifestyle preferences. The investigation employed facial recognition software that processed hundreds of thousands of images from driver's license databases, military personnel files, college yearbooks, and employment records. They interviewed every documented rescue worker who had been present at the derailment site, showed composite sketches to trauma counselors and emergency room staff, and even consulted with retired train conductors who might remember unusual circumstances from that night. But as the months turned to years and the budget climbed toward astronomical figures, Crawford began encountering resistance that suggested their target was not merely elusive, he was actively evading detection. Privacy laws designed to protect military veterans created barriers that money could not breach. Sealed personnel files, classified mission records, and confidentiality agreements that covered emergency response training exercises formed an impenetrable bureaucratic fortress around certain categories of information. When Crawford's team attempted to access specific databases, they encountered digital roadblocks that suggested someone with government-level clearance was monitoring their queries. More concerning still, the team began detecting professional-grade counter-surveillance around their investigation activities, subtle indicators that their inquiries were being tracked, their movements observed, their communications possibly monitored. Crawford recognized the signatures of intelligence community tradecraft, the kind of operational security that suggested their target possessed skills far beyond civilian emergency response training. The breakthrough came not through digital investigation but through human intelligence. A retired fire chief in Waterbury, Connecticut, remembered an unofficial responder at the Hartford derailment, a young man in military fatigues who had appeared at the scene without being dispatched, worked alongside official rescue teams for several hours, and then disappeared before incident reports were filed. The fire chief described him as tall, lean, with gray eyes, and the kind of calm competence that suggested extensive training. He had worked methodically through the wreckage, locating victims with uncanny accuracy, and had been specifically focused on the third car where Rebecca had been trapped. Most intriguingly, he had refused to provide his name or unit identification when supervisors asked for documentation. This single witness account provided the first concrete evidence that Rebecca's savior had indeed existed, but it also raised troubling questions about why someone with rescue training would operate outside official channels and then vanish without leaving any record of his presence. What Rebecca did not know, could not have imagined even in her most paranoid moments, was that the object of her $50 million search was closer than she could have conceived. Closer than Crawford's sophisticated surveillance network had detected. Closer than her own daily routine would suggest possible. Marcus Garrett, though he had not used that name in over 7 years, pushed his cleaning cart down the marble-floored corridor of Callahan Tower at precisely 11:30 each night, his movements economical and purposeful. To any casual observer, he appeared to be exactly what his uniform and identification badge suggested: a night janitor employed by Morrison Building Services to maintain the offices where power brokers shaped the global economy. But appearances, Marcus had learned through 15 years of covert operations across 3 continents, were the most effective camouflage available to those who understood how to manipulate perception. At 38 years old, Marcus moved with the controlled grace of someone who had spent years navigating hostile territory, where a single misstep meant capture, torture, or death. His gray eyes, the same shade as storm clouds gathering over the ocean, continuously assessed sightlines, exit routes, and potential threats, with the automatic precision of a man whose nervous system had been rewired by prolonged exposure to combat environments. His current assignment had lasted 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not the custodial work, which served merely as operational cover, but his real mission, ensuring that Rebecca Callahan remained alive long enough to build the empire that unknowingly employed him as her invisible guardian. The irony was not lost on Marcus, that the woman he protected with professional detachment and tactical precision was the same 18-year-old college student he had pulled from twisted metal during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise with the Connecticut National Guard 18 years earlier. Every detail of that night remained vivid in Marcus's memory with the crystalline clarity that trauma reserves for moments that reshape the fundamental architecture of a life. He had been 20 years old, driving back from a weekend training exercise focused on urban rescue techniques, when emergency frequencies had crackled with reports of a passenger train derailment just outside Hartford. Though not officially dispatched to respond, his training had made stopping to assist as automatic as breathing. The scene had been chaos incarnate. Multiple cars derailed and overturned, electrical systems sparking in the darkness, fuel leaking from ruptured tanks, and the screams of trapped passengers echoing through the night air like something from a nightmare. Emergency responders were still en route, leaving a handful of passing motorists and Marcus himself as the only assistance available for dozens of critically injured people. He had worked systematically through the wreckage, using his training to prioritize victims based on injury severity and extraction complexity. But when he reached the third car, something had changed in the mathematical precision of his rescue operations. The girl trapped beneath twisted steel had looked up at him with blue eyes that held terror, but also trust, and when she whispered her name Rebecca, something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what it meant to save a life. She had told him she was studying business administration, that she wanted to build something important someday, that she believed people were capable of incredible things when they chose to help each other instead of competing. She had made him promise to remember her name, and as he worked to free her legs from the metal that had nearly claimed her life, Marcus had realized he was experiencing something that military training had not prepared him for. The recognition that some people were worth dying to protect. The extraction had taken 43 minutes of careful work, with improvised tools and techniques learned in combat engineering courses. Marcus had talked continuously during the process, keeping Rebecca conscious and calm while he calculated angles and leverage points that would free her without causing additional injury. When the paramedics finally arrived and took over her medical care, Marcus had stepped back into the shadows and watched them load her into an ambulance that would carry her toward whatever future she would build. He had not intended to disappear. His plan had been to check on her recovery, perhaps visit when she was stable enough for visitors, maybe even reveal that he had been the one to pull her from the wreckage. But the federal investigation that followed changed everything. When Rebecca's family transferred her to a private medical facility, investigators from the Department of Homeland Security wanted to know why a National Guard trainee had been first on scene at an accident involving the daughter of Harrison Marsh, one of the Defense Department's primary weapons contractors. They suggested that the timing was suspiciously convenient, that Marcus's presence might not have been coincidental, that someone with his military training and security clearance could theoretically have caused the derailment as part of a larger conspiracy. The investigation lasted 8 months and concluded that Marcus was exactly what he appeared to be, a young soldier who had stopped to help, because helping was what soldiers were trained to do. But the experience taught him that good intentions could be misinterpreted by people with suspicious minds and federal authority. It also taught him that Rebecca's family operated in circles where even random acts of kindness were viewed through the lens of political and economic paranoia. So Marcus had enlisted for active duty and spent the next decade proving his loyalty in places where heroism was measurable and bureaucratic second-guessing was irrelevant. Afghanistan first, where he specialized in extracting wounded soldiers from collapsed buildings and overturned vehicles. Then Iraq, where his unit conducted search and rescue operations in urban environments, where every doorway might conceal an improvised explosive device. Finally, Somalia, where he learned that saving lives often required taking lives, and that moral complexity was a luxury that combat environments did not permit. But military service had changed him in ways that made returning to civilian life impossible. The constant hypervigilance required for survival in war zones could not be switched off when the shooting stopped. The psychological evaluation that preceded his honorable discharge labeled him functionally stable, but emotionally compartmentalized military terminology. For a soldier who had seen too much death to return to ordinary life, but remained too valuable and too skilled to simply discharge and forget. Private military contractors paid exceptionally well for men who could eliminate threats efficiently and sleep soundly afterward. Marcus's specialty became long-term covert protection for high-value individuals who faced dangers they could not address through conventional security measures. Politicians who had received credible death threats, corporate executives whose business decisions had made them targets for kidnapping or assassination, journalists whose investigations had exposed organized crime networks with long memories and unlimited resources. The work suited his psychological profile perfectly. It required the hypervigilance that had become his default mental state, utilized the tactical skills that 15 years of military service had drilled into his nervous system, and provided the sense of purpose that came from protecting people who genuinely needed protection. Most importantly, it allowed him to save lives without the bureaucratic oversight that had complicated his relationship with official military service. When Meridian Protective Services assigned him to the Rebecca Callahan Protection Detail, Marcus initially viewed it as just another high-value client, requiring discreet security services. Corporate executives faced a surprisingly wide range of threats in the modern business environment. Industrial espionage networks that targeted trade secrets and strategic plans, hostile takeover attempts that sometimes included personal intimidation campaigns designed to pressure key decision-makers, former employees who blamed their unemployment on corporate restructuring and sometimes expressed that blame through violence. But when Marcus reviewed Rebecca's case file and saw her name in the client documentation, he realized that fate had arranged for him to complete what he had started 18 years earlier. The 18-year-old college student who had whispered her name to him in the darkness had grown into a woman who commanded billions of dollars and employed thousands of people, but who also faced dangers that conventional security could not address. Rebecca's board of directors had hired Meridian Protective Services because 3 separate incidents in the previous year had convinced them that their CEO needed protection beyond what corporate security could provide. A former employee terminated for embezzlement had been arrested outside Rebecca's apartment building with a loaded handgun and detailed notes about her daily routines. A corporate espionage network linked to foreign governments had attempted to infiltrate her personal staff with operatives trained in surveillance and data extraction. Most seriously, a hostile takeover attempt by a consortium of international investors had included what intelligence analysts characterized as classic intimidation tactics, anonymous threats, surveillance of family members, and deliberate security breaches designed to demonstrate vulnerability. For 3 years, Marcus had maintained perfect operational invisibility while ensuring that Rebecca's daily routines remained secure, her building protected, and her life shielded from threats she would never know existed. The custodial work provided ideal cover because maintenance staff had access to every area of the building, worked during hours when offices were largely empty, and were essentially invisible to the executives whose spaces they maintained. The closest calls had been subtle but potentially lethal. A maintenance worker with falsified credentials who claimed to be repairing elevator systems, but whose real purpose was installing surveillance equipment linked to the same foreign network that had previously targeted Rebecca's personal staff. An administrative assistant whose background check had somehow missed her connections to organized crime figures who specialized in corporate extortion. A delivery driver whose route patterns and timing suggested coordination with hostile surveillance teams mapping Rebecca's movements and vulnerabilities. Marcus had neutralized each threat quietly, professionally, and permanently. The maintenance worker had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack in the elevator shaft while conducting his illegal installation work. The administrative assistant had resigned suddenly after receiving a job offer from a company that existed only in carefully constructed corporate documentation. The delivery driver had been arrested by federal authorities on charges that would ensure he remained in prison for the remainder of his natural life. But Marcus's most challenging opponent had been Rebecca herself, specifically her determination to locate and identify the man who had saved her life 18 years earlier. Her $50 million search represented a threat to operational security that grew more dangerous with each passing month. Every investigator she hired was a potential security breach who might stumble across classified information about Marcus's current identity and mission. Every database query her team submitted increased the chances that hostile parties would identify her psychological vulnerabilities and develop strategies to exploit them. Every witness interview they conducted created additional opportunities for enemies to learn about her past and present circumstances. Most dangerously, Rebecca's search was attracting attention from organizations that specialized in leveraging personal obsessions against high-value targets. Corporate intelligence networks that traded in executive vulnerabilities had begun monitoring her investigation, recognizing that a CEO who would spend $50 million searching for a stranger represented a perfect target for psychological manipulation. Foreign intelligence services had flagged her search as evidence of exploitable emotional instability. Organized crime syndicates that financed themselves through high-level extortion had identified her obsession as a potential pressure point that could be weaponized against her corporate empire. Marcus's handler at Meridian had been increasingly explicit about the security implications of Rebecca's search. Maintain operational cover, neutralize the investigation, or terminate the assignment through whatever means proved necessary. In the vocabulary of private military contractors, terminate assignment was euphemistic for eliminating the client rather than continuing to protect someone whose behavior threatened the security of ongoing operations. But Marcus found himself unable to view Rebecca as simply another high-value target whose protection had become inconvenient. The 18-year-old girl who had trusted him to save her life had grown into a woman whose determination to find him revealed a loyalty that military command structures rarely inspired. Her willingness to spend unlimited resources searching for someone who had shown her kindness demonstrated exactly the kind of character that had made saving her feel like the most important thing Marcus had ever done. The decision to reveal himself had been tactical rather than emotional, though Marcus admitted privately that the distinction had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Rebecca's search was accelerating toward discoveries that would compromise not only his identity, but the entire protection operation that had kept her alive for 3 years. Better to control the revelation than to let hostile parties use it against both of them. 18 months earlier, Marcus had detected the first signs that Rebecca's investigation was being monitored by parties with government-level surveillance capabilities. Database queries that triggered automatic alerts in intelligence community systems, financial transactions that appeared on watch lists maintained by organizations that tracked suspicious spending patterns, communications intercepts that suggested foreign intelligence services were developing targeting packages based on information gathered from her search activities. The elevator encounter had been carefully orchestrated across several weeks of preparation. Marcus had identified optimal timing, calculated conversation strategies, and prepared contingency plans for multiple possible outcomes. When Rebecca stepped into the elevator that Tuesday morning at 7:23, she was unknowingly entering a controlled environment where every word would be measured for its impact on her future safety and his operational security. Their exchange had been brief, but precisely calibrated. Marcus allowed carefully selected details about his background to surface military training, rescue operations, domestic emergency response experience. He watched recognition flicker across Rebecca's face as pieces of an 18-year puzzle began aligning in her consciousness, but he also monitored her reactions for signs that she understood the potential dangers of pursuing her investigation further. When she asked his name, Marcus gave her the identity he had been using for 7 years. Ethan Blake, borrowed from a soldier who had died in Afghanistan when an improvised explosive device destroyed his convoy. The real Ethan Blake's family deserved better than to know what their son had become after surviving wounds that should have been fatal, better than learning that he had spent years in psychiatric facilities before disappearing into the shadow world of private military contracting. But Rebecca's investigation of the name Ethan Blake triggered exactly the response Marcus had anticipated and feared. Crawford's team discovered within hours that Ethan Blake was a fabricated identity, professional-grade false documentation that would fool most government agencies, but could not withstand the kind of intensive scrutiny that $50 million could purchase. When Crawford's investigators attempted to locate Marcus for questioning, they found his apartment cleared out with military precision. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no trace materials that could link the space to any specific individual. The revelation that their target had vanished, the moment Rebecca started asking questions about his identity, forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of their relationship. The man she had spent $50 million searching for had been playing an intricate game whose rules she did not understand, whose stakes she could not calculate, and whose outcome might determine whether she lived or died. The text message that summoned her to the parking garage came from a phone that intelligence analysts would later determine had been purchased with cash, activated with falsified identity documents, and used for exactly one communication before being destroyed. The message itself was brief but unmistakable. Parking garage, level B3, corner space 247. Come alone. We need to talk. Rebecca found him waiting beside a dark sedan with license plates that subsequent investigation would reveal belonged to a vehicle that did not exist in any state or federal database. The man she had known as Ethan Blake looked different in civilian clothes, younger somehow, more approachable, but his posture and the way his eyes continuously scanned their surroundings revealed the hypervigilance of someone who had spent years expecting violence to erupt without warning. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. "Thank you for finally giving me the choice," Rebecca replied, though she understood even as she spoke that the choice was largely illusory. She was alone in an underground parking garage with a man who had demonstrated the ability to completely disappear when circumstances required it, whose real identity remained unknown, and whose motivations might include reasons for ensuring her permanent silence. What followed was a conversation that would redefine everything Rebecca thought she knew about the past 18 years of her life. The man calling himself Ethan Blake began by revealing his actual name, Marcus Garrett, though even that might be another carefully constructed identity designed to provide her with the illusion of truth while protecting information that could prove fatal if disclosed. Marcus explained that he was a private contractor specializing in covert protection services for high-value individuals who faced threats beyond the capabilities of conventional security measures. Meridian Protective Services had been hired by Rebecca's board of directors 3 years earlier because corporate intelligence had identified multiple credible threats to her safety that required military-grade countermeasures to neutralize. When Marcus reviewed the client list and saw Rebecca's name, he had requested the assignment personally. The 18-year-old college student who had whispered her name to him in the darkness 18 years earlier had grown into a woman who commanded billions of dollars, but who also faced dangers that conventional protection could not address. Her board of directors understood that Rebecca's death or incapacitation would trigger a catastrophic collapse in stock values, hostile takeover attempts by international competitors, and potential national security implications given her company's contracts with federal agencies. For 3 years, Marcus had protected Rebecca while she unknowingly searched for him, creating a paradox that neither of them had understood until this moment in the parking garage. Her $50 million manhunt had been monitored by hostile parties who specialized in turning personal obsessions into leverage against high-value targets, but it had also been the unwitting catalyst for protection services that had probably saved her life dozens of times. Corporate intelligence networks that traded in executive vulnerabilities had identified Rebecca's search as evidence of psychological instability that could be exploited through targeted manipulation campaigns. Foreign intelligence services had flagged her investigation as an opportunity to develop blackmail materials that could influence American corporate decisions affecting international markets. Organized crime syndicates that financed themselves through high-level extortion had recognized her obsession as a perfect pressure point for threatening her business empire unless specific demands were met. But Marcus revealed something that transformed the entire context of their conversation. His protection of Rebecca over the past 3 years had not been purely professional obligation driven by corporate contracts and financial compensation. The frightened girl who had trusted him to save her life during the darkest moment of her existence had become the most important assignment of his career, not because of payment or professional advancement, but because protecting her felt like completing something that had been left unfinished 18 years earlier. The choice Marcus offered Rebecca was stark and immediate. Disappear together while his former employers and their resources neutralize the threats her search had activated, or return to her normal life while he managed the cleanup process, knowing they would never see each other again. 6 months of complete invisibility. 6 months of living entirely off the grid, while teams of specialists eliminated every person and organization that had flagged her search as an opportunity for exploitation. The price of her obsession with finding him had been higher than the $50 million she had spent. It had put both their lives in immediate danger from parties who viewed personal connections as weaknesses, to be exploited for profit or political advantage. But the revelation had also exposed something that neither Rebecca nor Marcus had expected to discover. The connection that began in twisted metal and darkness 18 years earlier had survived the deception, the lies, and the professional distance he had maintained while protecting her. Standing in the shadows of an underground parking garage, surrounded by concrete and steel that reminded them both of where their story had begun, they recognized that what existed between them transcended the categories of gratitude, obligation, or even love as conventionally understood. Marcus was offering Rebecca the same choice he had given her 18 years earlier. Trust him completely with her life, or face the consequences of her decisions alone. The difference was that this time, she understood exactly what she was choosing, and why the choice mattered more than anything else she had ever decided. Rebecca powered down her phone deliberately, the gesture symbolic of disconnecting from the digital infrastructure that had defined her existence for decades. Her assistant Margaret would assume she was in back-to-back meetings. Her board of directors would assume she was traveling for acquisition negotiations. The corporate empire she had built was sufficiently automated and systematized to function without her direct oversight for perhaps 72 hours, before anyone started asking serious questions about her whereabouts. Marcus had prepared a safe house in rural Vermont, completely isolated from internet connectivity, cellular service, and any form of digital communication that could be monitored or traced. 6 months of honest conversation about who they actually were, when stripped of professional obligations, corporate responsibilities, and the mythology that had shaped their understanding of their relationship for 18 years. As they drove north through the night toward an uncertain future, Rebecca experienced something she had not felt since she was 18 years old. The sensation of being exactly where she needed to be, not because of what she owned or controlled or had achieved, but because of who she chose to trust with the truth about herself. The man beside her was not the heroic savior of her imagination. Marcus Garrett was someone who had spent 15 years in places where violence was the primary method of resolving conflicts, working for organizations that paid enormous sums for results without asking uncomfortable questions about methodology. He had protected her for 3 years, not out of professional duty, but because pulling her from that train wreck had been the most meaningful thing he had ever done, and losing her to the consequences of her search for him would have felt like failing to complete the most important mission of his life. Rebecca had built a corporate empire while searching for redemption, in the form of a mythical figure who existed only in her memory and imagination. What she found instead was something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. A person who understood that some connections transcend rational explanation, that some choices define the fundamental character of a life, regardless of their practical consequences, and that love, when it finally develops between two people who truly see each other, is worth sacrificing everything else to protect and preserve. Behind them, the machinery of corporate power would continue functioning exactly as Rebecca had designed it to operate. Board meetings would be rescheduled. Acquisition negotiations would proceed through established protocols. And the technological empire she had built would generate profits and expand market share without requiring her constant supervision. But ahead of them lay something she had never possessed despite all her financial success and professional recognition: the possibility of being completely known by someone who had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to remain present. Marcus had spent 3 years learning her behavioral patterns, her daily routines, her fears and strengths, and the subtle signs that indicated when she was under stress or facing difficult decisions. Now Rebecca would have 6 months to discover who he actually was when the professional masks were removed, when tactical deception ended, and when all that remained was the truth of what they meant to each other beyond the roles of protector and protected. The safe house in Vermont would become the place where a $50 million search finally concluded, not because she found what she thought she was looking for, but because she discovered something better: the courage to stop searching and start choosing, the wisdom to distinguish between mythology and genuine connection, and the recognition that sometimes the greatest protection comes not from being saved by someone else, but from being truly seen and accepted by another person who understands the cost of survival in a world that rarely rewards honesty or vulnerability. In 18 years of searching, Rebecca had never imagined that finding her mysterious savior would require losing everything else she had built. But as the highway carried them toward a future that could not be purchased with corporate resources or controlled through business strategy, she understood that this was what redemption actually looked like. Not the restoration of something that had been lost, but the creation of something entirely new and infinitely more valuable.